This is Brighter Futures, the film series about how ideas improve lives and change policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Tracy Lawson from the School of Life Sciences, expertise on plants, on plant growth, on crops for the future in a sense. So welcome, Tracy. Tell us a little bit about your research on plants then.
So, well, in the plant group we do a whole host of research, but I specifically look at how plants exchange gases with the outside atmosphere. So plants take in carbon dioxide as the key substrate for photosynthesis, and as a consequence of that they also lose water. So the stomatopores that are on the plant leaves control that gaseous exchange, and therefore really important not only for productivity of crops but also water use and temperature cooling for the crops. So really they're vital to some of these processes that are key to plant growth.
So these stomata are little kind of structures on all plant leaves.
Yes, yeah.
And that's the way the gases come in and out, how they, as it were, breathe.
Yes, absolutely.
But the losing water is clearly important in the kind of context of changing climate and weather conditions for plants. So tell us a little bit about what it is that you're looking at.
So these pores open and close, continually moving to try and adjust that gaseous exchange, but when they open they let a lot less CO2 in than the water out, so the balance between the two is not optimal. So what I'm specifically looking at is to see if there's ways that we can manipulate these pores both anatomically and functionally to be a bit faster. So the dynamic environment is continually changing and these things are a little bit slow sometimes, species dependent, but can we speed them up to make the plants much more water use efficient? And that's really important at the moment because, as we've seen, we have very hot summers, no rain, and therefore we need to find plants that's much more water use efficient, or they're not going to be able to survive our future predicted changes in climate.
So under that kind of stress of drought conditions or extreme heat, plants are growing less optimally, less well.
Yes.
So there's a definite economic impact of that.
Absolutely.
And so we would see that. So take us for a little journey through the labs, through the plant growth facilities. What are we seeing with you and your team that you're working on? So
we have some quite high-tech kit that we use to measure these gas exchanges within the plant. So we have these sort of systems that we can clamp a leaf into a chamber and use what we call an infrared gas analyzer that measures the gases going in and out of the chamber. And then we use different light intensities for that on top of the chamber, different conditions within that chamber to see how that influences photosynthesis, water loss, temperature, and then a combination of these processes. We also do that in sort of really controlled environment rooms that have LED lights. So we're thinking about crops for the field, but also we have to think about food production in controlled environments, vertical farming, etc. Can we optimize that in terms of energy inputs with different light intensities, different light regimes that we've learnt from our field crops as well? So we sort of span the whole of the food sector in that type of research. So
that's understanding how current plants are doing things. Tell us then about, once you've learnt something about how plants are responding, how the stomata are changing to affect the loss of water or the loss of or the gain of carbon dioxide for growth. What then can you do with the design of plants themselves, crops, thinking into the kind of next stage? You know something, then what then happens at that point?
So once we understand those processes and then the genetics and the genes behind those processes, we do quite a bit of work within the entire plant group trying to manipulate some of those processes. So some of that's transgenic manipulations or gene editing manipulations of crops, and also looking at natural variation for some of those traits. But you can only do that when you understand it, and the gene editing and the transgenic crops helps us to nail down the specifics to making that crop better for the future, or those traits better that hopefully will allow the crop to be more productive in the future.
So just tell us a little bit about the gene editing process. So that's something that's relatively new.
Yes.
Last 10 years or so, something of that kind of nature from the initial discoveries. What are we doing? What are you actually doing to the plants and their DNA? And is it something that passes on to future generations? Is that the kind of plan? Yeah,
so I mean, we've used a whole range of approaches, gene editing for some of it, traditional cloning methods for others. So gene editing now is much faster, it's cheaper, and it doesn't sort of leave well, there's debates of whether you'd call that genetic modifications or not, but it uses a sort of natural system that actually just modifies individual bases or chunks of bases within that
So that's bits of DNA?
Yes, yeah. Whereas at one time, for traditional cloning, you take the gene and put the whole gene in to a crop, whereas now you can manipulate the expression of that gene. We're sort of looking at promoters, so Christine Rain's lab is looking very much at promoters and how they drive expression of genes. So it can just be simple changes that can really allow a plant to then produce genes that would help that plant accelerate for the future. And that would probably happen over time naturally, or could happen over time naturally as the climate changes. But the plants haven't had the time to do that because climate has changed much faster.
So climate's changing quickly, so we need quicker methods to do that.
Yeah.
And so is this delivering in that kind of space, that promise of faster change to crops? What sort of crops are we talking about, for example?
So a lot of work we've been doing on wheat, looking at natural variation, but also some modifications to that. But also we use model plants that we can use in the field for the fast throughput of that, and hope that then that will translate into a field crop. And there's been some real sort of step changes in photosynthesis that has translated into increase in plant growth and yields from just single gene manipulations, which I think are really promising for the future, and especially with the predicted changes in climate for the future.
Well, tell us a bit about some of those predicted changes. I know there are kind of, ranges. It could be this bad, it could be this, or, this okay. But in that kind of the range of what we're expecting, this is going to be happening quickly. Plants can't respond. Yeah. Evolution takes more time to bring those changes on. Yeah. So in a sense, you're stepping into that space to help do that.
Yes, and I think a prime example of that is actually from some of Christine Rain's work on SBPs, which has had a long history here at Essex for the last 20 odd years or so. But actually, that enzyme has a high control of photosynthesis, and especially as CO2 increases, that portion of photosynthesis, because the components that control it changes as the conditions change. As we push CO2 concentrations higher, that enzyme's probably got more of a control on photosynthesis, but at the minute the plants don't have enough of it because they haven't had time to adapt to end up having more of it. So a key part of some of the work under RIPE is to try and increase the amount of SBPs in a plant. And that's one gene change and showing some real promise in producing crops with greater yields.
So for those who don't know, enzymes are things that help other things happen.
Yes.
They kind of catalyse other things, don't they? So if you haven't got enough of it, the good stuff's not going to happen.
Absolutely.
In short.
So these are all part of a cycle, a photosynthesis cycle with many different enzymes. SBP is one of them. And there's just various components to that, and they all have to balance. But as climate changes, you maybe need different components of that cycle to make sure it runs all the time as efficiently as possible.
So more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere ought to mean plants have got more that they can take and to produce carbohydrates, which is how the carbon dioxide is used. But that might not happen if the processes are disrupted in some sort of way.
Yes. Well, of course, along with carbon dioxide increasing, which was sort of beneficial for most plants, not all, but will be beneficial for most plants, we have an increase in temperature, which sort of counterbalances that, because higher temperatures influence these enzymes and then they don't work as efficiently. Right. So we're trying to balance. The CO2's good, the temperature's bad, and it's like how those two balance with each other. And some enzymes are very, very temperature sensitive.
So what happened when, take us into the life of a plant. When in the middle of 2022 we have, for the first time in the UK, outdoor temperatures of over 40 degrees. Unprecedented kind of heat for those 3 days when it was like that. What's then happening in plants? Is it just temporary damage? Is it permanent damage? Have we got to think both short and long term when we're saying, well, what happened if this was for 2 weeks or for a whole month?
Absolutely. Yeah. So different durations will have different effects to whether that's short and they can recover, or whether it's long term and possibly not recovering. And of course, the temperature tends to go alongside water. So you get a high temperature and low water, and of course, as I was saying, the stomata that allow the water out of the leaf, that's a loss, but it also helps to cool the leaf. Yes. It's just like when we sweat, we cool. Yes. That's the same for the plant. And of course, if there's drought and temperature, they tend to use the water, then there's none available, stomata shut, reduces photosynthesis, reduces that water loss, temperature on the leaf gets higher, then the enzymes start to degrade, and there's a whole complex nature of things that's happening. And of course, the longer that's occurring, the less chance of recovery from that. Yeah. And even if there is recovery, it may be that you've already reduced the vegetation of biomass, and then you can't produce the grain or whatever.
So a current crop is gone, but the concern would be whether the seeds we have for a future, for the next crop, are going to work or suffer in the same kind of way. So it's quite an urgent task, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So yeah, exactly, because you need to harvest those seeds not only for producing flour, etc., whatever the end product is that we eat, but also we need that for the next generation. Of course, the seed quality, the seed amount, is all going to be influenced by that.
Does this suggest that we might need to be looking at different plants for food? I mean, evolution, natural selection has brought huge diversity, but in the food system we only use a dozen plants for most of the calories in the world. More than that, of course, but when you look at all the kind of vegetables and herbs that people use, but they're a small part of the total calorific intake. I mean, when you look at other things, are there interesting plants that can tell us something different about how these processes work?
I think there's a huge amount of research that's going on looking at that at the moment to see, what crops will we be growing in Essex in 20 years' time, or I don't know, 50 years' time, when the environment has changed. Do we need to look for different crops, and do we need to look for where those crops will grow? So there's lots of interest now in, of course, proteins and crops for proteins. They're coming up more, like peas and things like that, for these sort of pea proteins and different crops that can provide that. And also some of the more exotic crops that are grown elsewhere, can they become part of a staple food? That they are in some areas, and we've just never considered them. So there's quite exciting things to look at in terms of
the whole other area would be how to use plants and also fungi as a kind of input for meat substitutes, for meat analogues. Meat production is known to be pretty bad for the climate in lots of different ways.
That's right.
But if we could replace that with more plants, so we might be producing plants in different ways that aren't necessarily for our direct consumption as a plant, but we might be using them as what you might call a feedstock for some other kind of product.
Absolutely, and I think there's, again, lots of research that's looking into those areas and where you would grow them and where they'll grow in the future. And potentially on marginal lands that we would have not grown crops on previously. We've grown bread crops for yield, but there's also crops and plants can cope with very different environments, and we can maybe take some of those crops or traits and try and produce plants that will grow and be beneficial on marginal lands.
So if you were to put a kind of policy hat on now, or to be sort of talking to policy in the broader sense, so it could be, what the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN is trying to think about for the world as a whole, or for national policy. The lessons that you're picking up from the research, these kind of cutting-edge methods for understanding plants, and then for manoeuvring change to make things work for the future. What would you be saying? We're kind of confident that we're going fast enough, or are there still some kind of big gaps? Of course, there's always things to research.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. Yeah. But in terms of the progress that you have made, for example, in the last 5 years, would you look on that and say this is quite encouraging? Or
yes, but I think there's a lot to be done. And if you look at the targets of potentially doubling food production by the year 2050 or 2070, whatever those, that is a lot to do, and we're still nowhere near that yet. Yeah. So I think there's huge amounts that need to be done, and that needs input and resources, and we also need to be able to try and grow some of these crops in different places to check that they grow in different environments. Fair as doing something in a lab or a greenhouse, but that has to translate into the real world outside, and see if those traits are useful and viable outside. So there's a huge amount to do too.
And there'll be cultural practices that farmers and farming communities have, kind of norms that they're used to engaging with. I guess a lot of people understand that things are changing quite quickly, particularly with respect to climate and weather patterns within the year.
Yeah.
So in that sense, might be making it slightly easier to encourage the new thinking.
Yes.
But then there are kind of norms where people say, well, we've always done this, and actually you're not going to be able to.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge emphasis on climate change now that's really in that public domain, which I think helps as well, and we can see it. We broke temperature records this year, not by 0.2 of a degree or 0.5 of a degree, like 1.4, I think it was, of a degree. That's huge. So I think people are noticing that, and they can see it and sort of really start to think about, and the next generations are really thinking about that for the future. I think you can hear them saying that, like, they're the scientists going to have to tackle these problems, and I think that's really encouraging that we can see shift in people being interested in that as well, because for a while it sort of drifted away, and things come in cycles.
Yes,
but
yeah.
I think we can definitely see that in the
Why should we bother with food production anymore? We can buy it anywhere in the world, was
Yes.
a policy response of 15 years ago, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So in the lab, finish with a kind of couple of thoughts about your and your team's immediate kind of priorities. Then what do you hope to achieve in the next kind of 2 or 3 years in terms of advances of this understanding of complex processes in plants?
Yeah, I think a prime example is the RIPE programme that's been going on now 10 years at Essex, and we're looking for the next sort of trench of that, where we're really trying to take a holistic approach at looking at some of the key genes involved in photosynthesis, like as I mentioned with Christine's work, but we're tackling that with temperature, Amanda Kavanagh's work, and also I've got some stomata. So we're trying to bring all that together, and I think that's really exciting because it's not one thing's going to be the answer, and I think putting all of them together by trying to make the plant more temperature tolerant, water use, and have a higher productivity is really quite exciting, and I'm really hoping in the next sort of 4 or 5 years we can start really seeing some of those deliver as we're pushing those forward.
So quite optimistic?
Yes.
Yes.
You've got to be optimistic.
Of course, exactly.
Glass always half full, not
Great.
empty.
Lovely. Well, Tracy Lawson, thanks very much indeed. You've been watching a Brighter Futures film about how ideas improve lives and change policy. For more conversations on these areas, pop over to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.